an exchange of ideas on health insurance coverage, and the legislature will soon have a new online look. Details in Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. This public hearing on the health insurance exchange brought dozens to the Capitol. They came for insight and details on the work of the task force.
The federal government is requiring us to not only provide assistance via those mechanisms, but also accept an application through online, phone, mail, and in person. As was mentioned previously, we have a call center today at DHS, but they don't process applications by phone. And so that's something that we're working through. Ideally, you would love to have an IVR system that could just take an application by phone very easily. We are not going to be able to do that likely in 2014. It's too much infrastructure to get up that quickly.
We caught up with Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Jim Schowalter earlier to discuss his new role as the head of the Exchange Advisory Task Force. You recently took over the task of leading the task force group that's creating this health insurance exchange. Has this for you been kind of a baptism by fire?
Sure has. And it's an exciting baptism because really the project has grown over time so that it's gone from just an idea that we were trying to get going to a full-fledged team of people that have been working with the Department of Commerce that will be now working with Management and Budget. And their job is really to stand up a very large operation that will hopefully help serve Minnesotans by simplifying the health insurance options, helping individuals and small businesses get access to health coverage at affordable costs.
And this change in command comes with just a couple of months before the recommendations are due, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but first, let's talk a little bit about this change of command. And according to the September 24th St. Paul Legal Ledger Capitol Report, there was some discontent among some of the stakeholders, like the Chamber, regarding transparency and divulging information that affected them. So is that what precipitated the governor placing you in charge of this task force? And if so, how have you addressed that?
What we really are trying to do is make sure that all of the state agencies have their roles clearly defined. And I think the governor was really clear about the conflicts that were there with the Department of Commerce and regulatory matters that they had to do with the exchange. And now we're actually building a business that they're going to have to regulate. And at some point, we were going to have to make a change. Also, I think it's really important to recognize that the health exchange isn't going to be a state agency. I don't know that anybody really wants it to continue being a state agency over time. So this is just the next stop for the health exchange. In time, hopefully it'll be a public-private entity, something that's more independent from all of the state agencies.
You've been touring the state discussing this issue. What have you been hearing from people thus far?
I think it's a huge issue. And
do people understand it?
No, and it's something that it's because it is a complex thing. It's part of a federal health reform bill, and probably the one thing that everyone does get, and I think actually everyone agrees on, is that the state has an opportunity to do something special. That the state could just opt and say, we're not going to take this one on, we'll do a federal health exchange. We know that'll be created, we'll just take whatever they do and we'll figure out all the problems that happen with it. But that's not really the Minnesota way. And we've got a responsibility as a state to take advantage of the expertise, of the information that we have, and really make something that works for the state. And really the exchange blueprint is trying to create that document so that everyone understands what that path will be, what are the specifics, and hopefully answer some of the questions that have been percolating up over the summer.
Now, recommendations from the task force are due in just about a month. Mm-hmm. How much work do you think there's left to go? What's the learning curve been for you? And how do you get this blueprint together in time?
Fortunately, there's a lot of really smart people working on this. And so while I have to get up the learning curve, the workforces, the task forces, the working groups have experts. We have experts from all segments of society giving us their ideas, giving us their perspectives on these various ideas. Some of them, everyone comes to the same point, yeah, this is what we should do. Other pieces are controversial. They're just controversial by their nature, and we're going to have to get those resolved. Fortunately for us, the federal government isn't making us resolve those things by middle of November. We've got a little extra time. That's really critical, and as the governor indicated, that'll give us a chance to continue to engage with the task force members, but especially with legislators, with stakeholders, and ultimately get something through the legislature in January.
And we've been speaking fairly ambiguously thus far. How can you kind of articulate a little more specifically for our viewers what they can expect, whether you're a Minnesotan or a business person who might be providing insurance to your employees? What do you think at this point can people kind of expect?
What they can expect is a website that will give them an opportunity to find, compare, and choose health plans that work for them as individuals or small businesses. There will be the ability to filter and find plans that work for them, and there will be an ability to understand different levels of quality or different levels of cost so that people can start to compete. By people, I mean plans can start to compete on quality. They can say, okay, here's what we've got, here's the plan that we've got, but here's the information about the results that this plan creates. We can start to use some of those unique advantages in Minnesota, and that's what we're trying to create.
Does this, you mentioned it'll primarily be done via website, so does this kind of inspire, for lack of a better word, a sense of fear among people who are not tech savvy? Because there are still plenty of people out there who can't even text.
Probably, and I get that, and that's why we know this is an incremental process. We know that there are going to be people who are going to be necessary in the communities to help people find their way into the exchange, help them assess their options, understand those choices. That's going to be part of the plan in the end. How we make that decisions or how we make those things, that's what the working groups and the task forces are all about.
Commissioner, what expectations did you have when you found out that you were now going to be in charge of this, and are you realizing those?
I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I knew that this was a big project. What I didn't understand and what I've realized is just the amazing people and energy that's around it. And it's one of those issues where, yep, there's political differences, there's outlooks, and people expect more or less, but in the end, it's just an amazing project that includes technological issues, includes fierce political issues and policy issues. But in the end, I think everyone kind of gets to the same point of saying this is an opportunity for us to do something that works for the state. We all know that the federal government is bigger, gets to set some of those rules. We're going to have to figure out how to comply within those rules. And the more that I talk to people, despite all the differences, the more I find that there's some common ground that we can work on.
And you touched upon my last question, the political differences. There have been some legislators who have been vehemently opposed to this idea. Mm-hmm. Are some of them coming on board at this point, or do you find that, well, this could be a tough sell if it's a Republican-led legislature next year?
I'm sure it's going to be a tough sell for some people. This is a change. This is a big change in how we approach insurance, how we approach insurance as a state and as a nation. So I am sure there are going to be some people who, in the end, won't support it. That's okay. I want to make sure we have the issues framed up so that people know what their choices are. And so that when we get to the legislative session, the governor can have a recommendation out there that's very clear, hopefully brings a lot of people along, and we can have a good debate about what we're going to do.
Okay, Commissioner James Schowalter, thanks so much for coming in and discussing your newest task. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator David Hann, the chair of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee, has been very vocal in his opposition to the Federal Health Care Act and on the health insurance exchange. Well, he joins me right now to talk about the new leadership for the Exchange Advisory Task Force and a little bit more about what he's hearing from the public on this issue. Thanks for joining us today, Senator.
Glad to be here.
Let's begin with Commissioner Jim Schowalter from Minnesota Management and Budget. He is now leading that advisory task force. What do you think that the commissioner brings to the table?
Well, I think Commissioner Schowalter is certainly an experienced person in government. He was a part of the Pawlenty administration, so I think in many respects he has a little bit more of a bipartisan approach to the work that he's done in various departments of state government. I think he's well respected by people on both sides, and I think, in my view, I think we'll see what happens, but I think it's certainly a step forward from the standpoint of trying to bring some greater transparency, shed some greater light on this whole process. So I welcome the change.
And you were quoted in the September 24th St. Paul Legal Ledger Capital Report. Maybe what this signals is a desire to take this more seriously as a policy matter and to attempt to see if there's a way to do something positive with it. So how would you like to see things going forward, and kind of compare how it was and maybe how you, again,
well,
how you envision
I think, again, people should remember that this federal law, of which the exchange is only a part, was a very, very partisan federal law. One of the most partisan bills ever passed, had no Republican support, has been broadly opposed by the public ever since its passage, is still broadly opposed. It's an issue in the national elections. Its future is uncertain, and I think as a matter of practice trying to implement something like that, you're going to face a lot of hurdles. And I think that the way that this has been approached at the state level, at least in Minnesota, has been to continue that very partisan approach. And I don't know that that's been very successful. To me, one of the cardinal problems with this has been the administration has not come forward and said, here are the specific problems for which an exchange is the solution or the exchange is the answer. Instead, they've come forward and said, well, we're going to do this, and we have to do it because the federal law says we have to do it, and we're just going to push this through, and we've created this committee, and we're going to have these meetings, and we're going to do these things, but the results of those meetings and the things that are being talked about are been held very close, and no one really knows what is being talked about or what agreements are being reached. There has been no legislation that has been proposed. So there's a lot of unknowns about what is exactly going to be proposed by the administration and what the problem that is going to be resolved by this exchange. I think that's the key. And what I hope is with the change that Commissioner Schowalter will sit down and let the public see what the administration has in mind. We'll actually produce some legislation and also talk about here are the problems that we see that this particular solution will help. That's what's missing.
Well, the recommendations on the exchange are due shortly, in maybe a little over a month. So what level of involvement have you had thus far in this task force, this advisory task force, and would you like to see your involvement maybe increase as this deadline gets closer?
Well, the deadline that is being talked about is a framework, they call it a blueprint, and there are a number of things that have to be reported to the federal government to sort of show to them that we are on track. And of course, a lot of this is going to hinge on what happens at the federal level in the election. Depending on who's elected, I think we're going to continue down the path, or perhaps it's going to be put on hold and sent back to Congress for some further review. So whatever happens, we'll see. But the thing that's due after the election is a report to show that we are on track, and there's a number of things, I've forgotten how many, quite a number of things that have to be acknowledged or reported on. And we're going to produce, according to the commissioner, some report to show our progress on those issues. What they've told us, and I believe that they're telling us the truth, is that these things are not substantive, they're not policy, they're not telling us what the governing structure is going to look like, they're not telling us what the form of revenue is going to be raised to pay for this. They're staying away from all the controversial, substantive issues that surround the exchange. What they're really talking about reporting is, here are the things that we've put in place that if we're going to go down this path, here's how we're going to do it. It's sort of the technical framework to implement an exchange. That's what they're talking about doing. So those are the things that they are preparing to report, as I understand it.
What are you hearing from Minnesotans on this entire issue as you're out knocking on doors this campaign season?
Actually, very little. I think that for the most part, ordinary citizens are pretty far removed from the direct effects of this. This is, to me, an indication of a problem that hasn't been well defined. The people that I hear mostly from on this issue are people who are selling insurance agents who are very concerned about this because they see this as a direct threat to their ability to do business. And I also hear about it from people who are in the insurance industry themselves, the insurance plans, who also see this as a potential threat to the private insurance business. So I think the industry and the agents are concerned because they are looking at whatever may happen and the uncertainty about it as a potential threat to their business. And I think they are concerned, but most ordinary people, ordinary citizens who don't get immersed in the minutia of insurance policy, this has not risen to the level yet of being a concern, but it will.
And Senator, if you were to give perhaps one piece of advice to this advisory task force creating the exchange, what would it be at this point?
I would say write a bill. I would say the way that we need to do this in the legislature and the way that it would be helpful to the public is to take the ideas that you're thinking about, put them into a language of a bill, put it before the public, get it in front of a committee, and let's have hearings on it. That's how we should do this. It's one thing to talk about things in broad generalities. You hear these things all the time. And exchanges like, Expedia or, buying things online. Those things they all sound good. Everybody can kind of nod their head and say, yeah, we agree with that. But it's very, very far removed from what it's actually going to look like. And until you see a bill that specifies how things get done, who makes decisions, how it's going to get paid for, how it is governed, until you see those things defined in law, and until you have an opportunity for people who are going to be affected by those decisions to come and testify and say, this is how it's going to affect my life or my business, and have that debate in a hearing, that's when the rubber meets the road, that's when the details are spelled out, and that's where you really get a chance to decide whether this is going to work or not, and that's what we need.
And so what's your advice then for Minnesotans as this process moves forward?
I would say pay attention and be aware of this. And I would also say that to the extent that they are willing to engage at this point, I've always argued for the principle that we need to make sure that decisions about things like healthcare be made in Minnesota. It's one of the things I think that is troubling about the federal law. When you make decisions in Washington, D.C. that are going to dictate to the people of the state on how we're going to buy insurance or the prices we're going to pay or the things that we're going to have to put in place as far as the relationships between us and our doctors, when you make those decisions in Washington and they don't turn out so well, it's practically impossible to change them. I think that we need to make policy on health care and an insurance regulation here in Minnesota, and we need to do everything we can to preserve that decision making here.
Isn't that kind of what's being done though with this task force? Aren't they trying to get a step ahead and make it so that it's conducive to Minnesotans?
If the federal law says here's what you have to do, and they give you guidelines, and then they say, all right, now you can make your exchange within those guidelines, it's sort of well, yes and no. It's kind of like when the federal government says in education policy, here's the rules on No Child Left Behind, and you can implement the policy as long as you follow those rules. Yes, it's a question of, it's Medicaid, another federal policy. You can implement Medicaid, but you have to follow our rules. There's always that tension between the federal government saying, here's what you have to do, and how much flexibility do you really have under those rules? I think the fundamental question is, does the federal government have the primary responsibility to make those rules in the first place? And I would argue they don't, and that is really the central part of this debate.
Okay, with those words, Senator David Hann, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Governor Mark Dayton was joined by education officials to applaud the latest effort to reduce paperwork for Minnesota's special ed teachers.
Several years now, I've been going around the state. The number one complaint I hear from special ed teachers is the volume of paperwork and how that much to do takes them away from their classrooms, takes them away from their students, interferes with their teaching.
It used to be a summer project, and so it would take districts several hours, probably 40 hours for several people to put that together. I worked on this for about an hour on Friday, probably a half hour on Tuesday, and maybe another hour to finish it up. So it really is a big difference.
The legislature's online presence will soon have a new look. John Brune explains.
The Minnesota legislature's redesigned website provides an easy way to search for legislative information. The site combines the same convenient links to key legislative offices and departments, allowing for quick access to legislative resources. And to accommodate today's more accessible technology, the new design is now formatted for mobile devices. Here's a quick look at 4 website features designed to better assist you in accessing legislative information.
The top of the page is a row of drop-down menus, and we tried to make it clean with just a list of headings at the top, but as you mouse over them, you get a drop-down that includes a lot of links with information from that specific topic area. So we've tried to include as much information as we can on the page, but not distracting from the content on the page down below.
The navigation is built so that independent of what body you're in, you'll have the same links. So for example, if you want to look up your senator's information, you don't necessarily have to go to the senator's site to look up senators from the House site. You have that link available to you right away.
The navigation at the top is designed to be universal throughout the site, so no matter where you are, you get the same links at the top, so you can mouse over the House or the Senate or committees, and those links are always the same no matter where you are.
Staff members have been working for the last 20 years to get as much legislative information online as possible and to help people learn about it. This redesign is just another step in the process. We have the same reliable information, but we just want to make sure that people can find it as easily as possible.
We've had a number of users that come to the Capitol to visit with their members, and they don't always have access to a PC. So they have their tablets and they have their phones. And even from the public external, we're going to be able to watch television on your phone, contact your legislators from your phone or from your tablets. It's independent of a PC, so that it's accessible to everybody wherever they are.
Watch for the Minnesota Legislature's redesigned website, coming fall 2012.
The state capitol, like many historic buildings, holds a treasure of stories from years past. The Minnesota Historical Society is bringing those stories back to life, as it does each year, in its annual Shadows and Spirits tour. What will people learn when they do this? What will they discover?
Well, the characters that they'll meet on the tour actually teach them something about the history of the building. These are characters who worked in the building or worked on the building. For example, there's a dome construction foreman. They'll run into an artist who painted the murals in the Supreme Court chamber, a woman suffragist. So there are a number of different characters that teach a little bit of a history lesson along the way.
Any big surprises? Do people walk out of here saying, oh, I never knew that?
I think so, yes. I think they'll find some very interesting fun facts.
What do you hear from people when they're done with the tour?
That was awesome. They really seem to enjoy it. And it's a wonderful family entertainment. It's not really a scary tour. It's more of just a fun entertainment for families. We do not recommend it for kids under 6, though, because the content's a little over their head, and it is kind of a long ways to walk. But it's a good entertainment for families.
Some of the Shadows and Spirits stories date back to the Civil War era, but there are many more stories to be told. We partnered with the Minnesota Historical Society to recognize the sesquicentennial of that nation-defining war by featuring Civil War artifacts on display throughout the building. Here's Brian Pease, site manager, on just some of those artifacts that we will be showing you in the coming weeks.
One of the important parts of any tour within the state capitol is to talk about the architect Cass Gilbert. And we have a bust of Cass Gilbert, who was commissioned to do the design work for the building of the Minnesota State Capitol, and that took place in 1895. He was a young architect, but also he had a sense of importance of Minnesota's history, but also this had to be a functioning and working space for the government of the state of Minnesota. And one thing that he had envisioned for the state capitol was to have a space that you would have adequate chamber spaces for the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and also the governor's office. And he wanted to remember the Civil War veterans by the placement of large flag cases where those Civil War flags would be transferred at a later date to be on display for the public of Minnesota. And so that was something that he designed for the state capitol. Well, that was pretty much all he really wanted at that time. He had envisioned the Capitol Mall expanding down in front of the Capitol, down towards St. Paul, and there they would erect a huge monolith, a huge monument that would represent and remember the Civil War veterans from the state of Minnesota and the more recent veterans of the Spanish-American War. Well, as the designs and the plans and the paintings were being kind of discussed through the public and through newspapers, members of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Loyal Legion, which were officers of the Civil War, another fraternal organization, and also the Minnesota Historical Society, were thinking we should maybe have a little bit more of Minnesota's history depicted someplace within the state capitol. And we have to remember at this time a lot of the political leaders, 8 governors had served as veterans of the Civil War. We had political leaders, senators, representatives who were veterans of the war, and even the Capitol Building Commission had 3 representatives or soldiers who had fought not only Minnesota but other states as part of their experience as young men. So as the building was being developed and decorated, that's where Cass Gilbert started kind of aligning and changing some of his direction to accommodate the need to remember what Minnesota had done in the Civil War. And next to the Attorney General's office and not far from the governor's reception room is governor's portraits, and one of those is Alexander Ramsey, who was our first territorial governor in 1849, but then later became our second state governor. And he has an important role in Minnesota's involvement in the Civil War. He happened to be in Washington, D.C. when Fort Sumter was fired upon on April 12th. Well, that fort surrendered on April 14th, and as soon as word spread to Washington, D.C. about the surrender of Fort Sumter and basically the beginning of the American Civil War, he was a friend of Simon Cameron, who was the Secretary of War. And he wrote a note because he had heard that Cameron was going to visit Abraham Lincoln. And on that note, he tendered the first 1,000 men for the Union Army. And those men happened to be from Minnesota. So he was, and we are given credit in Minnesota for being the first state to volunteer or tender men to be brought into the federal service to fight in the American Civil War. There was overwhelming response. There were, of course, just about 10 companies that needed to be fulfilled or filled to its full strength, and there were about 150 more men just waiting to get on the muster rolls. That was how much kind of fervor and patriotic fervor there was for fighting and trying to once again bring the Union back together. The governor really didn't have a lot to say over strategy or national politics, but they were really responsible, as Alexander Ramsey was, to get the men mustered in, to get the recruiters out there and to bring the quota that was required by Washington, D.C., to bring those men up to full complement and to represent the state of Minnesota throughout the entire Civil War. As the war progressed, of course, you're going to have other governors becoming the leaders of the state of Minnesota. And one of those during the Civil War was Stephen Miller. He started out as an officer with the 1st Minnesota and then became colonel of the 7th Minnesota and then served in that position until he was breveted a brigadier general and then elected to the last 2 years of the Civil War to fill out his term of office as a Civil War governor. Other governors that came after him were also Civil War veterans. You have William Marshall, who was a colonel of the 7th Minnesota after Stephen Miller. He also was one of the founders of the Republican Party in Minnesota when that was created in 1855. He, as well as many of these other men, had been through various battles, had been wounded at several points of their career. But of course, when we're looking at the Civil War, the war was won by the Union and by the Republican Party, so many of the men who were being elected in the state were from the Republican Party. So we have Stephen Miller as a Republican, we have William Marshall, Lucius Hubbard, a very well-known governor in the 1880s, also the colonel of the 5th Minnesota. He was wounded several times in the battles he fought in. He had 4 horses shot out from underneath him and survived the war to become one of the leading political leaders in the state's history. And we have veterans of the Civil War all the way to Sam Van Sant. He was the final Civil War veteran to serve as a governor in the early 1900s.
We do hope you take some time this fall to attend the Shadows and Spirits tour or to come see some of the Civil War artifacts displayed here at the Capitol. But that wraps up our program for today. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartkey. Thank you for watching.